we've examined what weak positions look like. They're positions that, if exposed to a court of law, will fall down. They're positions that, if exposed to the court of public opinion, destroy the organization. They're positions that work counter to High's mission, and they are positions that have a high statistical probability of damaging the very people that High was formed to serve, the participant. But what does a strong position look like? Well, first of all, it has to have the opposite criteria. A strong position strengthens the organization's reputation through being effective in a court of law, in public opinion, and impact relative to mission. So what would a strong position look like for the Human Awareness Institute? Well, I think, first of all, if one High facilitator that we know of in a very obvious and recorded case has sexually abused a High participant over a 10-year period in 2 waves, then it's a weak position to fight with reality. In other words, that is what is happening and has happened. And so pretending that it hasn't happened or will not happen again or is not happening with another facilitator at this time is weaker than saying, look, our cult raises people to be psychologically illiterate, abusive, to externalize their own wounds onto other people. And so it is inevitable, if the organization has the benefit of a future, that a High facilitator will sexually abuse, as will team members, participants in the future. The cult is not going to suddenly start spitting out highly ethical, highly competent people to teach in these pretty marginal realms. Because the typical American, the typical Westerner, if they do everything normal, will go from cradle to grave with zero institutionalized, meaning it's not going to be taught to the parents as a condition to being parents. It's not going to be taught in kindergarten, middle school, high school. It's not going to be taught in college how to competently navigate these areas. Because we're not talking about something fundamental about human beings. We're talking about the fact that in a sustained cult of emotional trauma and psychological illiteracy, that mistakes will be made. And when you add some of the strongest drives, which include lust and need, in a cult that is filled with regression, with all kinds of unmet needs in the child and adolescent, it's a challenge for any adult raised in this cult to be a great teacher in the domains of psychology, relationships, sexuality, and trauma. It's beating the odds to expect anyone to be a great teacher in that domain. So a good position marginalizes the likelihood of that happening, meaning it takes a series of systemic steps. You can't rely on willpower to override intergenerational wounds. Never has. It's absurd to think that it will. And the system in place, meaning the cult system in place, produced all of the high facilitators, and all of the high facilitators are occupying weak positions in this domain. That system is not changing anytime soon, the system that produces facilitators in their current state. So the medicine, if there is to be a medicine, must come in the institutionalized protocols within the organization, be it high or any other organization, to overcome that probability field. Meaning, our cult makes it highly probable that abuses in this arena will occur. So the organization must medicate that probability with protocols that have a certain amount of kick, a certain amount of discipline built into them. And we also, obviously, having watched this process for 6 years and watched other victims come subsequent to my own, we cannot expect, meaning it's a weak position to expect, the facilitator body to suddenly just do a 180, because the exact same forces, the exact same drives, the exact same motivations and strategies for realizing those motivations are still in every one of the facilitator body today, every one of the team members today, and every one of the participants, at least that I've contacted. Or this pattern would be overturned as we speak, and I wouldn't be here making this video. So let's start with what the ideal strength or the ideal strong position looks like. If you look at geometry, a strong position, you think of the triangle, because the more weight you put onto the side of the triangle, the more it presses down and stays anchored. So, wind blows over a triangle, it's pushing it down. It's a stable position. So what does that look like? Well, any form of education or therapy is medicine. Medicine for ignorance, medicine for intergenerational abuse cycles, medicine for cultural blind spots. To be beneficial, it must be medicinal of the wound, the cult wound, that we're predisposed to be infected with. So, what is the medicinal ethic? Well, the Hippocratic Oath is an oath that doctors take, and it is a commitment, first and foremost, never to harm a patient. And in this case, this is never to abuse and in particular being a school that, high pays some lip service to love and into me you see. But as you can see, the entire thrust of the facilitator engagement with this sexual abuse survivor is one of secrecy. Meaning, the number one goal, the top goal of every facilitator at High is to put a lid on this narrative. Well, that's not into me you see. But at the same time, there is, meaning if you survey 100 High participants prior to attending High and afterwards, you will see a tremendous correlation between not participating in High and participating in High in sexual activity. Well, whether it's looking at people's genitals, touching, exploring. High refuses to define sex. Sacred energy exchange, this, that, the other. Well, you could say it's all on a continuum of proximity. And the higher you get towards, multiclimactic orgasm, the more you create influence. Meaning people are influenced by one another to the degree that they are close. If you are profoundly close with another person, mentally, emotionally, sexually, and physically, in other forms other than sex, logistically, you have an increased impact on one another. So as sexuality increases, impact increases. Now, as we all know, sex is neutral. It's not love. It's not hate. It's an amplitude increaser. And when you're really close to someone, you can hurt them more than if you're further away. When you're really close to someone, they can hurt you more than if they're further away. Now, this is the fear of all forms of intimacy: physical intimacy, emotional intimacy, mental intimacy. I spent a little time with a high lover who would leave her body the moment I entered her. And I found it disorienting. And she wouldn't come back until we weren't sexual. In other words, one defense mechanism against being deeply affected by someone is to dissociate. You can have my body, but none of my feelings. And this is, of course, a defense. It's not natural for an infant or a child to do this. This is an intelligent defense if you have learned that after physical intimacy comes emotional pain. You want to have sex with me? Fine. I just won't be there, and as a result, I won't be emotionally hurt when something goes wrong. This is an intelligent defense against the often disastrous consequences of rapid sexual activity. So it is irresponsible and undesirable to encourage increased impact and amplitude of impact without establishing a high probability field that once the impact is increased, it will be mutually beneficial. Now, there are an endless number of ways where it is not mutually beneficial. If someone's trauma is triggered and the partner doesn't know how to deal with it, and they don't know how to deal with it because they're trauma literate or illiterate, it's not a beneficial outcome. If one person is highly sensitive and the other person doesn't grasp that or know how to attune to that, or the person doesn't know how to pick someone who's sensitive to their sensitivity, it's not beneficial. If one person has attachment disorder and either reflexes and needs to push the other person away right after getting close, or needs to cling while the other person has dissociated emotionally, it's not beneficial. If one person falls deeply in love in the child state of need, and the other person is keeping it physical, the child is hurt and betrayed. These are just a few of the many things that happen a large percentage of the time. Now, we have little crude ways of working around that, such as don't have sex on a first date, get to know the person first, but high eclipses that, to where you might have sex before a first date. You might have sex in a high workshop where that is the first date. And high provides a container within the workshop that makes certain states possible or probable that are not probable outside of the workshop container. And this is where a lot of the community burn-up takes place, because within that container, a certain state in both parties is elicited. Those states are compatible or feel beneficial. The workshop container is over, and the parties involved have not learned how to create a similar container to make that state sustainable. And suddenly they're different people. And the person you felt safe with in that container, you no longer feel safe with out of the container. You don't know why. You don't know what to do about it. So, first, do no harm dictates that literacy, emotional literacy, relational literacy, psychological literacy, goes ahead of physical intimacy and reaches a state of confidence and mastery that can be self-generated. Or the undisputed increase in sexual activity during and post high workshops will have a high probability of doing harm. Now, in the abuse at the humanAwarenessInstitute.org website, I go into, of the roughly, 60 high participants that I've been lovers with, I go into all of the things that went wrong and do go wrong. It doesn't matter if I'm connecting with an intern. In my level 3, which happened in my first month of exploring high, I connected sexually with a high intern who was also my buddy in my level 3. And it never occurred to me that upon being sexual on a Friday night, she would proceed to disconnect from me sexually and proceed to have sex with 3 or 4 other people during the workshop. Nor did it occur to me that when this triggered my attachment disorder, that's people who have an all or nothing type attachment template, as opposed to a nice gradual slope that's within conscious control. It never occurred to me that when the shit hit the fan, I would have nobody capable of empathizing, because she was psychologically illiterate about attachment templates, and so was I. I just knew it felt absolutely terrible. And I had no language to address it when it was occurring, just like the next participant has no language to deal with it either. So what's a strong position, given that this is the reality? And even if it's only a reality for 15%, let's just say that 85% of people have developed enough defenses before working with high and just dismiss all the love crap and say, yeah, I know how to put up enough walls so that as I get close and then fissure apart, I will be fine, and I will enjoy the physical stimulation. Well, hospitals in the medical paradigm do not have the luxury, without disclosing in advance, that their treatment severely traumatizes 15% of the people, and they'll just be left on their own to deal with it. You have things like informed consent and disclosure. You're not at choice in any of these areas because you don't even know what they are. But there's a tremendous amount of trust elicited, beginning with a mission statement that says we're committed to the whole world winning. Well, that includes the 15% in the circle. So a strong position that gets stronger the more pressure is put onto it, meaning the more it's brought to court, the more it's written about in articles, the more scientific study is done, the more data is gathered, the position looks more and more sane. That's a strong position. So what is that position? Well, first and foremost, you will not be sexually abused at high. Now remember, that's not real as a reality because of the probability field set up in the cult. I mean, statistically speaking, 25% of Americans have been participants in sexual abuse. So and America is known for denying and hiding its shadow, meaning it's just a few decades ago before American psychologists were writing in the textbooks that only 1 in 4 million American children were being molested and were incest survivors. 1 in 4 million. Furthermore, the textbook went on to say that this probably was a good thing because the young woman in question, having been raped by her father, would be more sexually adjusted by the time she was ready to get married. And as a result, might even be able to please her husband. This could be beneficial. And you could understand where they might be coming from, aside from the fact that the 1 in 4 million, might be 1 in 100, 5 in 100 children subject to incest. But you do actually find a reality that attractive girls with symmetrical faces, etc., are more likely to be sexually raped and molested as children. There's also the phenomena of the cutter that goes involved. Highly abused children cut themselves, and they're doing it to get control of their wound. Now, when the wound is raped innocence, and you feel out of control, then in order to get control of that particular wound, you don't cut yourself. You initiate abusive sexual relationships with older people. In other words, you're taking ownership of the wound in which you feel helpless. And the reason for that is simple. A helpless horror and overwhelm is the lowest human state. And powerful, meaning control, is the medicine for helplessness. So if you move from abject helplessness to powerful self-inflicted wounds, meaning wounds within your control, you can induce the illusion that you are in control of your life. So children who have been physically mutilated cut themselves so that when the memory of severe helplessness as they are being mutilated comes up, that they could do nothing about it, is overlaid with a present-day wound in which they feel powerful because they're doing the cutting. They're mutilating themselves. As a result, they stop feeling helpless and feel self-determined. So this is psychological medicine. It's still at the expense of their body, of course, but this is a known psychological trait. Now, little girls and little boys who have felt the overwhelming helplessness of a father or mother or older brother who demanded something from them that they could not give, that left them feeling confused, overwhelmed, terrified, helpless, in pain. Also apply this same approach. So one of the best ways to tell who was incestuously molested as a little girl or a little boy is by who is most promiscuous as a teenager. This is likely to be the person who gains power. In other words, she's inverting the wound. It's typically a girl. By showing her leadership in sexuality, by making the boy, usually, feel overwhelmed and uncomfortable, by taking his virginity, by creating a power-need dynamic and punishing, giving and withholding, experimenting, leading in that arena. Now, this is a symptom of a severe wound that the entire cult has failed to protect her from. No one trained her parents. No one even interviewed her parents to say, were you molested as a child? Because it's usually intergenerational. Sometimes it moves from physical incest to emotional incest. my mother got off on rubbing baby powder all over me. My mother's sister got off on taking nude photographs of me at age 10. I met their father, one of the creepiest men I've ever seen. He reminded me of a snake. Well, that's what people in the reptilian brain do. And those are traumatized people, meaning the cult didn't protect my mother's dad either. The cult didn't protect him. It didn't protect my mother and her sisters. And it didn't protect me. If my mom wants to get pregnant at age 19 in a dissociated emotional state, clueless on how to raise children, oh, isn't it wonderful? You're going to have children. It is profoundly, contemptibly incompetent as a cult. And then suddenly the next generation gets that their parents were fucked up because the parents are shame-based. They don't say, I'm so sorry I'm fucked up. Please don't listen to us. We don't know what we're doing. Go out and study psychology, and maybe you'll learn how we're fucked up, and then come back to us and teach us, because we didn't bother to learn. We just took responsibility for a completely innocent life and did what was done to us. And our parents didn't make any mistakes either. These are the parents that raised your facilitators. And it's typically the people who get most fucked up when they're young that take the most interest in psychology, become therapists. You can see that pattern here. Why have I studied 1,000 hours of all of this stuff? Why am I so passionate about it? Why am I talking to you? Because it nearly killed me to go through the facilitator protocol. And yet, in many cases, if I look at the map given to me by High, and I went to High to learn what I realized I couldn't learn from my parents, to actually learn about love, to learn about intimacy, to learn about sexuality. So if we look at that, I could look at just about every single thing Peter Sandhill did and didn't do. And I could shame myself. I could say I was at choice. You see, Peter never grabbed me and raped me. And everything he did, he will tell you, was out of love. But High doesn't define love, so you can't argue with that. It is the room of love. So with absolutely no cogent definition of what love is and trying to emulate my teachers, I've actually abused other High participants, other lovers met at High using Peter's protocol 10 years ago. If that was love, then what I was doing was certainly love, because I never physically harmed or raped or pressured anyone to do anything either. But what I wanted to do was not healthy for many of the people I did it to. And I had no vocabulary or map other than that they were at choice. So if it crossed my mind, I learned from High to ask permission. May I have permission to do this? Oh, sure. Well, why are you leaving your body? Why is this not working? In other words, it is normal in an abuse cult for people to say yes to things that are terribly destructive to them, but which they got punished for saying no to by originally their parents. So we're on quicksand. We're on quicksand. And I think it's possible, if not probable, that you can do more harm to someone who's saying yes every step of the way than one might do in certain rape scenes where the person is saying no, but you do less damage because there isn't the emotional proximity in a rape in many cases. In other words, following the high protocol, whether it's Peter Sandhill or me or anyone else, you can harm someone more than rape without them having the language to do anything but blame themselves, and without you having the landscape, the map, the distinctions, to have a clue what you're doing. Though if you watch the impact, the lost innocence, the addictive compulsiveness, you'll realize that what's going on is not good for you and them. But you don't know why, because you're in the room of love that isn't defined other than whatever's going on in the room. This is a disaster. Now, it turns out it wasn't Einstein, but it's still true that the level of ignorance, that the level of intelligence, or stupidity as the case may be, needed to create a problem cannot get you out of it. You don't get out of the problem you created with one level of intelligence until you reach a higher level of intelligence. And there is nothing in our cult, meaning I've been waiting for 6 years for the high facilitators to find a way out of the stupidity of positions that will fall down in court, that will fall down in public opinion, that will damage their patients and damage themselves. They haven't found it. It's not floating around in our cult's ether. I've found it because I've taken 1,000 hours, and also because there's no back pressure. Having dissociated from the Human Awareness Institute, I had no more pressure to see things in their lens. Once you've hurt a lot of people, you have a lot of psychological pressure from your peers who have also hurt a lot of people, not to acknowledge a paradigm shift that goes from we're saving the world, aren't we wonderful, this is just what the world needs, to we're fucking up a good percentage of our own clients and ourselves and don't have the intelligence to see it or the ethics to gather the data, make it public, and change paradigm. Because that's the scientific method. You don't just tell people this is love. You ask them how loved they feel. And you dig into it with humility. You know, if Peter, rather than insisting that he loved me and wished me well 10 years ago, had asked me, because I gave him all kinds of clear feedback that I was terrible. In fact, I told him in one of the interactions, I said, Peter, this was my rationale to stop the first round of therapy with Peter. I said, Peter, I feel terrible in our sessions. I did. I said, that's one thing. Now you say I need to move through that and all this, but the reality is I only feel terrible with you. I don't feel terrible with the other facilitators. I feel terrible with you. And I said, I don't feel terrible when I'm alone. I feel terrible with you. And I said, you could be right. that it's all my stuff, right? Because this is the transference of shame. But I said, I don't see why I should drive an hour to your house, an hour back again, spend several hours with you, and pay you money to feel terrible with you when I can just stay home and feel better. Now that's as big a crack in the ice as you could possibly ask for if you're actually open to learning and you don't know what you're doing. Even if you don't know that you don't know what you're doing, which is a common blind spot, that's a clue. You could, Peter could have said, I'm making sexual advances on a straight guy. I'm your therapist. There's probably some good reasons why you feel terrible. Please tell me about this, because obviously I don't know what I'm doing. Let's stop the clock. I won't charge you a dime. Here's your money back. Let me learn how I made you feel terrible. And I could have told him. But what I couldn't do at that time was alienate the leader of what I thought was going to be my doorway into love and belonging, something I needed, everyone does. Something I desired, everyone does. And something I believed I would get at high. Well, I was getting traumatized and re-traumatized and going through a whole variety of things at almost every workshop. But if you believe that that's all for the good, you have to follow your map. You certainly wanted to be in a room filled with love. Well, that's what this was called. So the position is first, do no harm. Now, high may be incompetent. It may have so many blind spots and so much buried shame that cannot be faced. Because it's a big thing to go from we're saving the world, we're the heroes, we're the leader, to we've been fucking people up and haven't realized it. And it's on us because we've been defending that position rather than learning. But of course, the way to do that is to send out a universal email. High brags about 40,000 clients. Has High ever sent out an email saying, how many of you were raped in our community? What's the percentage? How does that compare with the general public? How many of you experienced attachment disorder? Well, you have to tell them what that is, because they have no idea. Oh, I've experienced that many times. I just didn't have a name for it. I've experienced it in almost every single lover relationship in the community. Why? Because I have attachment disorder. I just didn't have any language for it. Well, scapegoating dictates at this point that you make it all about one person. No one else on the planet has attachment disorder, just Dane. And he probably, you get rid of the good people who talk about things, and then you can remain blind with everyone else who's agreed to shut up and smile and go along with the dogma. No, this cult is filled with people with attachment disorder. How do I know? Because many of my high lovers had attachment disorder as well. I got to the point where I would not sleep with someone. A high woman will jump into bed like that. In fact, I had a high woman come over to my house, get undressed, get ready for sex. And I said, wait a minute. I'd love to have sex with you, but we're going to have a 4-hour conversation first. You're going to know me, and I'm going to get to know you first. Oh, it was too much trouble for her. So she got up, dressed, and left. But why did I insist on the 4-hour conversation at that point? Because sex triggers attachment. And once you've got a 6-year-old little girl in there who's desperate for love and believes it's going to come from you, that 6-year-old little girl will lie through her teeth not to upset you and lead to rejection. So I learned I could not trust high women to tell me the truth about what they wanted and didn't want after we had sex. In enough cases, and of course you don't know till it's over. I wouldn't know before having sex this is the one who's going to get totally attached to me or not. I didn't know. I learned that after the fact. But that's too late. Then you have the 4-hour conversation and realize you're completely incompatible, and you've got a terrified 6-year-old who will do anything to stay in relationship. It's not her fault. It's her teacher's fault. It's the cult's fault for not giving her a competent map. Well, what do we do about that? There has to be a data-based position. You know, the Catholic Church was a master at hiding the fact that 5% of its priests were pedophiles and enabled it. They are complicit in gross incest and sexual abuse, along with their long history of brutality, terror, and trauma throughout history. They're not holy. They're fucked up. You've got to invite in the data. Now, the most responsible thing that any facilitator, and it just takes one, can do is gather 1,000 people's data, because that's a good representation of the other 39,000. You gather 1,000 people's data. You know, you don't filter all the ones that praised you. No, you send out an email to 1,000 people. How were you hurt at high? How were you confused at high? How many of you are still believing that high has the answer, and how many of you have gone elsewhere after running into brick walls? What are your criticisms of high? What are your criticisms of the high community? And then you publish that data anonymously. You don't have to give out their names. Metadata. Out of 1,000 people in our workshops, 50 were raped. 100 did things they didn't really want to do but couldn't understand why they said yes. 500 trust the organization less than they did in level 1. Whatever those numbers are, that's the disease. That's the harm in the first do no harm that a competent medical professional, that a competent leader does their utmost to avoid. Now, none of the high facilitators are competent trauma and sexual abuse licensed therapists. How do you know that? Well, I haven't heard from them. Now, when you're part of a gang and you're actually competent and your gang is abusing someone, like take the Point Richmond event, where a guy starts raping a girl and about 20 bystanders get out their phone and film it. And some get off on it. No one stops the rape. They are legally complicit. Why? Because all 20 of them, and easily in group, could have pulled the guy off, could have called the police, but they didn't. They are complicit in the crime. Every single high facilitator is complicit in Peter's sexual abuse and gross misconduct. They're complicit by enabling it, by recommending him without disclosing his license category. They're all complicit. Now, you can justify that all you want because you're in the cult. That's fine. it doesn't hold up to public scrutiny. There's no educated member of the public that will back up that position. Oh, the poor high facilitators. Of course they didn't know what to do when one of the people they recommended sexually abused a participant. Of course they didn't know what to do when he got PTSD because of their negligence. Well, what the fuck are they doing teaching if they don't know what to do? So they're complicit by occupying a role they don't know what to do. They can't do the role competently. So you can like the person, you can make excuses for them, but it doesn't change the weakness of the position. The position that is strong for any leader, any therapist, any team member, and any participant is this: before we escalate sexual activity in our organization, before we influence the amplified proximity of traumatically, psychologically, relationally illiterate people, we will put the safety guards in place. And telling the victim that they were at choice is shaming without doing that. That's something to practice. Meaning, a safe emotional conversation could do wonders in this terrain. It's something to practice. I really appreciate how horny you feel to me. I feel really attracted as well. And there's some things you need to know about me. Once I have sex with you, I will feel absolutely desperately in need of you. And here's the only way that that was going to work for me. Once we have sex together, I'm going to push you away like this because a certain feeling that I have no idea what it is going to come up. And I push people away. Carol Golden was kind enough in her intern role. And you have to wonder about the intern selection. See, I have tremendous empathy and appreciation for Carol Golden. But when I expressed sexual interest in her, she pulled me aside and she said, "Dane, you don't want to be my lover." And I said, "Why?" She says, "I let men come in and then I really hurt them." And I said, "Thank you so much for telling me. You're absolutely right. I don't want to do that." But I gave Carol the space, unconsciously, because I'm curious and listen, to say that. And she gave, and I said, "Why do you do that?" And she talked about being beaten up, hit with 2x4s by her family, by men, abused. And I said, "Wow, I'm so sorry." And I am. She's not going to learn anything about trauma and PTSD and intergenerational abuse patterns and what is and is not love at High. And as an incredibly beautiful and attractive body who is part of that group of people who is seeking control and autonomy by reenacting the abuses done to her, by initiating them. You know, she told me she would just seduce someone, let him fuck her without a condom, just a complete stranger. And then feel terrible about it. There's nothing for Carol to feel terrible about. What's terrible is a cult in which she can go through school being taught that algebra is more important than learning how to protect her own body from her own family at home. That's what's outrageous. And High's not doing anything about that. There's been no books from any facilitator talking about these types of issues. Why not? You hear the stories over and over. Why not? Why doesn't one facilitator have the guts to say, of the last 1,000 participants that I've seen in my practice, this one was molested by a facilitator, this one was molested by a team member, this one was molested by a member of our community, this one repeatedly gets in, finds the person who's going to hurt them, and I sit there and I charge money to listen to them, and they don't stop because I don't know what I'm doing. Why not? Why isn't that book out there in metadata? Now this, you see, there's no shame in Carol Golden's innocence as she reenacts the pattern. And you can see her kindness coming up. There's a pattern in there that she can't stop once it starts. Meaning, she was kind enough to tell me that if we had sex together, she would hurt me. But I didn't have to have sex with her, and she never hurt me. And that was kind of her. That's her kindness coming through the pattern. But is it kind to tell her she can be an intern and that it's perfectly fine because the facilitators are fucked up as well? And there's no shame in the facilitators being fucked up by a cult that fucks them up. This is innocence being warped. There's no shame in that. But it is still irresponsible to say, this guy is a great person, he can help you, when he can't. That destroys trust, it destroys innocence. I could talk for hours about specific people who don't have a clue in this terrain. And I could talk for hours about all the stupidity, the cruelty, the abuse that I perpetuated without having a clue. Because I went to High and thought I was going to learn how to do this stuff. And none of the things that came up, which I would usually take to Ann Watts. Ann, I like this person, but she only wants to have sex with me when I criticize her. And I don't want to criticize her, but I really want to have sex with her. Ann hasn't a clue. Why? Well, in Jason Weston's words, trauma is not a high focus. Meaning, they're not making it their business to learn the number one reason these things are happening, which means they're creating a reality where everyone loses again and again and again. And in that framework, it becomes hard to create a growing momentum of community. Because, I think up to my first 6 workshops, I was still convinced that I was going to learn everything and just plow through it. But the learning plateaued after 6 workshops, and the other 24 were just me trying to solve these problems which kept coming to me. And I solved a lot of them. But they were not welcome because I was solving them alone. Like, no one at High could understand why I wanted to have a 12-hour conversation prior to being lovers. That was ultimately my medicine for most of this. I learned that if I had a 1-hour conversation of what does friendship look like to you and what does it not look like? What's your ideal partner and what isn't your ideal partner? What patterns do you want to break in your next relationship? And what patterns do you want to, just spend an hour each on these 12 topics? And then we could see. They could see me, I could see them, and we could actually have good relationship. Now, this is my version of a safe psychological sex conversation. I was rejected at High for requesting this because it was strange. Why was it strange? Because High wasn't teaching it. The question is, since it worked, meaning sometimes we get to hour 6 and it'd be really clear that we shouldn't have sex because we shouldn't be in a relationship, and sex was entangling. And it was so lovely to say thank you for 6 months of avoided tragedy, all saved in 6 hours. That's intelligent, but it's unusual. It's painful because most of the time, these 12-hour conversations were for the woman, meaning I'd watched women get hurt and have no idea why they were hurt in relationship to me. And I realized why they were being hurt, and I realized what wasn't being discussed. So I realized if they saw me before they got attached, they wouldn't get hurt. So I was doing it for them, so they wouldn't get hurt. And their response was to reject me for insisting on a shield that was for their well-being. And it is painful. It is painful. It is maddening to be rejected and rejected and rejected for the one thing that I've found that works. You want to know how great this works? It's the story of my wife. I met her, wasn't the slightest bit interested in her. I just asked how I could help, what was going on in her life, etc. I gave her some tips, said goodbye. But I said, if I can be of any further help, just send me an email, tell me what's going on. We did back and forth, and I saw, wow, this person is just growing like mad. She is waiting to blossom, but she has no map. And I knew all about that by this point because I'd already been fucked up by the facilitators. And I'd already learned about trauma, and I'd already started studying psychology. So I helped her. And at the point where I began to fall in love with her beauty, just the beauty of the human spirit, I asked her if she preferred to have me as a free mentor or if she preferred to have me as more than a free mentor, as a lover. And I said, you know, I can see this is useful to you. If you want to send me emails for the next 5 years, I'll take 20 minutes a day, as long as you're doing the work, and watch you just fly. It's beautiful. She said she wanted to be lovers. And I said, I have one condition. I want you to write down every majorly emotional thing that has happened to you since birth. Anything that you have strong feelings about in memory or present day, I want you to write it all down. And she tapped this out on her phone, 38 pages, and sent it to me. I looked at it, and I saw a totally clear pattern. I saw where the pattern was diseased. Diagnosis is just something that's way off balance. So I saw the disease pattern. And I also saw that the disease was coming from her family, her cult, her religion. It was coming from the outside. Her outside had fucked with her from birth, all in the same angle, all giving the same message. In this case, a message of worthlessness, a message of trauma, etc. So now I had the diagnosis. And I looked at myself. And I said, if I'm going to be healthy and good for this woman, I'm going to have to be in an outside environment that leans in the opposite direction of this pattern. I'm going to have to do the antithesis of everything she's known from birth. Which then the next question is, can I pull that position off and not be unhealthy myself? Because I will have to emphasize certain parts of my personality and de-emphasize others, or I will be part of the disease. Well, I wasn't sure I could pull it off, and so I explained my PTSD, that I was in the worst position of my entire life thanks to the facilitators. I wasn't sure I could pull it off. And I told her, the deal is, I believe you need someone like this to balance a lifetime of this. And I said, I may fail at that, and that's my fault. Nothing on you. I said, I will know if I'm able to be a good person, and we'll talk daily about how it is. There's a good chance I'll fail. If we fail, we'll have to disconnect. And that will not be because you're not lovable and all that. It'll be because I was raised in a fucked up cult that hasn't taught me how to do any of this very well. But as long as your life improves every day that we're together, I'll hang in there. And if it doesn't, this will be the way we close our relationship. I said, do you understand that I don't know myself that well in this terrain because I've got PTSD and I haven't gotten to learn who's Dane with PTSD. I don't know what those boundaries are. That's the most terrifying part of suddenly having your identity shift. So she said she understood. Of course, nobody does. But I was having a very positive impact on her life, and I was in love with the beauty of who she was becoming. And so the next criteria I had was that this not be a climb and crash pattern. So, like if you give someone a bunch of money and become a sugar daddy, it's a climb and crash pattern. No. We had to go up in this direction every day being something she could hang on to. You know, that she was learning to do these things herself, and I would accelerate them, but she wouldn't crash because they were her hard-earned muscles. You know, she was doing the daily meditation. She was doing the yoga. She was writing the diary. So she was doing 80% of the work. And earning that work so that if I died, because I didn't know if I'd be alive today, if I died, she wouldn't crash more than about 20% and could rebound. So that was the criteria, and that's the criteria to this day. She's now my wife. I'm incredibly lucky because she's kept ascending. So now I have, in my life, one person who's amazing and grows and learns, etc. So that is something no one, I think I'd asked probably 50 women or so around high and in the general community. Anyone up for helping me see you before we crash together? It's a good idea. I just can't be bothered. I'd rather roll over every year or so in a heap, and hate men or whatever it is. It's like, that is so boring. It's so inefficient. 38 pages is all it took. And I knew she was amazing because she was the only woman in the world who would do it. Peter Sandhill was trying to get me to marry this other woman named Weepa at the time. I gave Weepa like a year because Peter kept insisting that this was my luminous future and his vision and his psychic powers and all, complete bullshit. She was completely incompatible. She wouldn't write more than a paragraph. And as soon as she would write a paragraph, this was Weepa, I would say, thank you for that paragraph. I am the exact opposite of the compatibility to this paragraph. And because she was attached, she just refused to write anymore. Because she didn't want to see that we were completely incompatible, because she was attached. So ultimately, that was a traumatic detachment with no consciousness, which is very normal. My position is that any school at all, that has anything to do with sexuality, particularly a public nonprofit, particularly dealing in Western culture where we're all born chauvinists, if not to women, then to feminine energy. I have been torn to shreds in this culture for being feminine. My masculine traits are elevated as if they're this wonderful thing. My feminine side, torn to shreds by women and men in equal doses. We're chauvinists in this cult. You cannot have a healthy, sustainable relationship without honoring the feminine in men and in women, as well as the masculine in men and women, and without teaching the masculine in men and in women to honor the feminine in men and in women. You have got to teach your masculine side, which is the dominant side of the cult, because that's the side the cult develops. You've got to teach your masculine to protect and revere your feminine before you're suitable for any kind of healthy, sustainable relationship. And all of that work is going counter to the stream and the messages and the media and the cult. We're now making this huge hype about equality for women, and of course it's about time. But the equality for women is still measured in masculine constructs. Okay, you can be a woman in Saving Private Ryan. Great. But can you be given respect for raising a child with psychological attunement and emotional literacy that 98% of the country doesn't have? Can you be given profound honor and bows for that? Nah. No. Let's save that for the woman who's having a cesarean section so that she can be on time for her Yahoo executive board meeting. That's our version of fighting for women. You know, the CEO of Yahoo, moving over from Google, wanted to prove she was just as masculine as any man. Prove it to us. Sure. She scheduled her birth. I'm going to arrive at this time. You're going to cut my stomach open, take the baby out, do this, and I'll go back to my board meeting. You see, I'm as competent as any guy. Fuck the child. Fuck my body. I'm not honoring the feminine. It's Marissa Myers. And she's elevated, you know, a woman executive. Well, as long as we're going to idolize people who destroy other people's lives by making lots of money, because let's face it, it's all about shareholder value. It's not about bringing well-being to the employees or the town. If we can save $2 outsourcing this to China and shut down a small town, oh, isn't it great? That's the kind of tough thinking we want in our chauvinist executives. Don't think of the families. Think of the $2. Think of the symbol of value rather than the well-being of human beings. This chauvinism is killing us. It's not intelligent. There's nothing strong about it. It's incredibly weak to give up your humanity just to get rank in a sociopathic cult. But weak people need rank desperately. You know, you abuse the shit out of someone like Donald Trump, he'll give away his entire humanity to climb up and hold on to power because he's had it beaten into him since he was 2 years old that's the only thing that anyone around him would care about and respect. Everyone needs love and respect. And if the only way to get it is to be a masculine sociopath, fine. Weak kids will do it. And traumatized, abused children are weak, not because they were born that way, but because their parents fucked them up. A strong position is that the Human Awareness Institute and anyone else in the business, I don't care if it's Body Electric, I don't see this as a one-off. I've been sexually abused at high, repeatedly. I've been given PTSD at high, and the actions have been defended that gave it to me. It's going on to this day. And this is the template, meaning what goes down with me, what's the final last thing. If I die tomorrow, for example, then High's playbook is elevate incompetent, chauvinistic facilitators, recommend them without disclosed license, sexually abuse the participant, convince them that it's love. When that's unsustainable, cover it up. When that's unsustainable, kick them out of the community and refuse to gather all day to try and shut down the websites if they publish them. And if they die, oh, what a relief. Because, wow, that would have been devastating to our important organization if the truth that we're doing the exact opposite of our mission and our public charter came out. And now repeat. That's the template. I'm not special. There's nothing special about me. And the only thing unusual about me is that I'm bothering to honor my feminine side and yours and our cults, and taking the flack for doing so, to see that that isn't the template for the next victim. Because none of my therapists, in or out of high, give a shit. The community doesn't give a shit. The team doesn't give a shit. That template is just fine. It's been going on for years. But I give a shit. And I'm willing to die, if necessary, to tilt it towards a template that's actually the best interest of high, meaning a strong position, everyone wins. And the position that I'm going for is that high is the best organization in the world at first preventing sexual abuse to itself, its team, its participants. Number one. It's not too hard. Number two, that when the inevitable sexual abuse by a facilitator or team member emerges, that it is handled in the way that would be considered a world-class best practice. So what are the results? I mean, what would you want from a world-class best practice? Well, you don't need to give the participant PTSD by shaming them and excluding them. That's a start. No. How about lifting all the shame from the participant? We're going to lift the shame from the participant. And we're going to educate the participant to recognize the abuse and have boundaries by defining love and defining abuse and defining the facilitator agreements and educating on the damage of lies. Lies are rampant throughout the high community. Nothing special about high. They're rampant throughout the cult. We are, almost all of us, infected and contagious with the disease of rampant lies. Yes is when we mean no. Doing all kinds of things to look good that aren't who we really are. Hiding affairs. Just one thing after another. And all of them do damage. And they all make sense in a sociopathic framework. They're just nothing to do with love or into me, you see. And they're dangerous in the proximity of sexuality. Because if someone is lying in order to have sex with you, you can't have a safe psychological conversation. Because the agenda is the addiction of release, which is also, it's important to understand that sex is a very strong addiction and that trauma, undiagnosed and undealt with trauma, elevates the need for sexual release. It's sometimes the only moment that a trauma survivor has a moment of peace in all of the repressed and regressed trauma. If you keep dangling that stick and teasing it, it's incredibly cruel. But even that can be worked with. I'm a sex addict and I need an orgasm. I'm a sex addict and I need an orgasm. I'm completely unreliable in this and that and the other, so am I. Could we participate in at least being honest around a rhythm of release that gives me a few seconds of relief from trauma, grief, and PTSD that I don't know how to deal with? Is there anything wrong with at least moving in that direction as a starting point, and then educating the community about trauma, you're not fit to get into the next relationship until you've read The Body Keeps the Score, until you've grasped what's going on there, until you realize that your partner over there hasn't read The Body Keeps the Score and is likely going to do damage to you and them and have no idea why. Because our cult is committed to trauma illiteracy to cover up its shame. The military starts it because it's expensive to heal PTSD. And so since the First World War, the higher brass in the military have been complicit in suppressing the story so that they don't have to pay benefits that restore men to people who won't beat their wives and harm their sons when they get home. Sacrifice the sons and the men. Let's save the military budget to develop more weapons of mass destruction. So the strong position is that any school, number one, is data-centered, that you send out regular surveys to your entire group to see who's being hurt where, who's being abandoned, who's being shamed, who's being ostracized for telling the truth, who's lying. These are viruses. How many people in our subcult are sick? And for how many people is the sickness increasing due to sexual proximity? And for how many people is it decreasing? This is how an epidemiologist addresses diseases in any cult. You measure it. You see, Gary Slutkin is doing work on the disease of violence. And just like any disease, it spreads. And the best predictor of where there will be violence is where the last violent outbreak took place, because it's contagious. So if you want to know where the next violent event will take place, just look at the last violent event and the vortex of energy put into place around it. And then you need a psychological shield around those people to de-escalate and clear out the disease. And then you heal violence. It's the same with lies. It's the same with betrayal. Where's the next betrayal most likely going to occur? In the person who was last betrayed. You can think of it in practical terms because we're materialistic. So if someone doesn't repay the loan to one member of the community, they're now $50,000 out of a loan. Well, the betrayal, you didn't pay your loan back. So I'm out 50 grand. I counted on that 50 grand to pay my mortgage. You betrayed me, so now I betray my landlord. Now my landlord becomes angry at the next tenant because tenants use you. So the virus of betrayal spreads. The virus of trauma spreads. The virus of lies spreads. The virus of pain spreads. You cannot contain a disease until you know who's infected, what's infecting them, and how to change the protocols to do that. And you cannot even begin to ask these questions when you've self-referentially defined the room in which all these diseases are rampant as love. Because lies are not love. Trauma is not love. Sex with a client is not love. Secrecy and excluding the client is not love. Ignoring someone in pain is not love. Sociopathic behavior breeds sociopathic behavior. So you've got to have a data set. You've got to know what the position that's strong is, and you've got to have people committed to going upwind. This is not a grace, go with the flow scenario. You go with the flow of our cult. You're a chauvinist, you're a racist, You're a sociopath? Have you no idea what the fuck you're doing in family and other relationships? That's going with the flow in our cult. You got to swim hard upstream. And a leader that's worth their salt isn't going to call all the diseases love. They're going to help you identify the map, realize the currents you're in, position to swim diagonally. Maybe you can't make it to the shore swimming upstream. Maybe you're going downstream every day because you're swimming for all you're worth at 5 miles an hour, and the stream, the river, is taking you out into the abyss at 20 miles an hour. You're losing ground every single day you're swimming in that current. You got to get out of the current. Then you can walk back up the hill and gain ground and find your bearings. You need maps that work. And it needs to be reflected in data. Until every past and present high participant is getting surveys that are turned into metadata that measure the diseases in the larger cult and measure the diseases in the subcult that's high or any other organization. You don't know if you're more sick than the rest of the cult or not. See, I don't think high is sicker or healthier than the general cult. I think that the contagion is amplified by the push towards sex and proximity. So psychological diseases are just like STDs. They spread and infect when you have unprotected sex. If you don't even know what a condom is in psychological terms, you don't know what you're protecting against. You don't know when you're infected. You just notice, I feel shitty. I want to feel like I did in the workshop. And then that draws you back after you recover and lick your wounds to something that's very ephemeral and then dissipates again. But what comes out of those interactions is a very mixed bag that happens at high speed due to the heat and proximity in the event. I don't think it's too much to ask. As an intention, as a position, as a participant, as a student, as a therapeutic patient, that any therapist or school that wishes to associate themselves with amplifying sexuality embody the very best practices for A, preventing sexual abuse, B, repairing not only the damage of the abuse, but repairing the damage to broken trust, repairing the damage to self-worth, repairing the damage to the broken heart of the feminine self, repairing the damage of trauma, of shame, of alienation and invisibility. Because Ann Watts, representing the entire facilitator body, asked me to keep all of this secret from you. Now I venture to say that you see me a little bit more clearly after this than you did if I stayed silent. If you are in the empathic regions of your brain, and it's no fault of yours if you're not, we breed reptiles in our cult. If you've up in here at all, you feel empathy, not just for me, but for the many me's that this me represents. This is a traumatized, sexually abused participant. It's not about me. I don't take it personally, and you and I should not take any of this personally. This is a conversation about where a school committed to winning and everyone else winning lands. And I'm just suggesting that it lands on a position in which everyone actually wins and discards the positions where everyone loses, and that has enough psychological literacy to know the difference between the two and is willing to back up the claims and the jargon by measuring the difference and reporting weekly, monthly, yearly on the metrics. What are the diseases in the community as metadata? And what are the protocols that can heal them? And are they working in next week's, next month's survey? Now, this will, of course, get rid of all the shame-based sex addicts who are absolutely convinced that they are unlovable and there's no hope for them, and as such are just much like the young French gay man who did a lot to spread HIV as an airline pilot. He'd fuck a guy, and then he'd say, "I've got gay cancer. I'm going to die, and so are you." Well, if you're absolutely terrified of death and you feel there's no way out, infecting as many people with your disease has a certain amount of intelligence to you. You're pissed off you got it, you want revenge, all of that. Those people dissipate from the community. If the community heals and shows good results, they may come back and give it a shot. But many people in our cult believe it is absolutely hopeless and are settling for fantasies or delusions or addictions, just to manage the pain. There's nothing wrong with these people. There's something wrong with a cult that infects these people to this extent. But you also need a core group that actually knows what their diseases are, protects other people and themselves from them, and is willing to be transparent. Is that 10 people out of the whole high community? 5, 50, 100? But that group needs to create a statistical field and protect it with protocol. You cannot expect the same people to suddenly produce different results in the exact same protocol that produced the last result. We're looking at systemic changes, organizational changes. Could it help to define best practices? Could it help to commit to those best practices? Could it help to educate your participants? These are the best practices we commit we'll follow for your benefit, because these are the best practices anyone has found on the planet today. Now, we're monkeys, a few 100,000 years out of the trees. What do we know? But these are the best practices that human beings have found anywhere on the planet. And we're tasking the whole community. If you find a better practice correlated with statistics, none of your dogma and no dogmatic arguments. If there's a new protocol that looks like it has a chance, 100 people do it. And then measure the results. Are they getting better than the rest of the community by doing that practice? If they heal their diseases at 5 times the rate of the rest of the community, then any sane person wants to be part of that practice. And it's a process of education. There may need to be infrastructure. Apps are powerful because if you set the app up properly, no facilitator can stop a participant speaking the way they could disconnect me from an email list. If we're going to build shame-based facilitators, you got to take the drug of power and control out of their reach. Because if they could have controlled themselves, they wouldn't have disconnected a participant's email at the very time he needed support to protect their shame. That's an addict. That's a sociopath. So you need to take the drug out of their hands. Then a shame-based sociopath might do the right thing because it's what's available to them. And because the consequences of not doing the right thing are now more damaging than doing the right thing. Even they can see it. We don't have to shame the facilitators for being highly sociopathic. They wouldn't be highly sociopathic if they had not experienced highly traumatizing sociopathic behavior from enough other people that they're scared of telling you the truth. No one hides their flaws if they're not terrified of the sociopathic behavior of those around them when their flaws are revealed. That's the equation. If you believe people are going to hurt you when you tell them your mistakes, you hide your mistakes. And if your mistakes are destroying the lives of other people, it's all one equation. The community has got to be more trustworthy and stop punishing people for admitting their mistakes. I'm not angry at High for having mistakes. I'm angry at the compounding endless loop where one mistake makes the other mistake, makes the other mistake endlessly worse at the expense of the very mission that the organization was founded to support. Now, we can have a conversation about what is the best practice in the world to prevent sexual abuse, to prevent trauma, and to recover from the inevitable failures of any group. And we can have a discussion about the protocols. Okay, so here's what we're going to do to stop facilitators abusing their participants. Well, what if that fails? Well, here's what we're going to do when that fails. And what if this happens instead? Well, here's what we're going to do if that happens. You develop a plan A, B, C, and D with one person in mind: the participant and the mission. The participant is the mission. If you don't give a damn about your participant, leave the show. Stop pretending to be leaders. Get out. But if you give a damn about the participants, and you have a set of protocols, and every leader commits to that and is tracked to that, every participant entering or exiting the community gets a list of the protocols as they enter and gives feedbacks as they leave. We haven't seen you around for 6 months. Did any of our members violate the protocols? Have you been hurt? Anything we can do to help? And this cannot all be laid on the feet of the facilitator body. You cannot do this work as a sex addict. Those people can go anywhere else in the world and find abusive protocols to fuck people with. The mission dictates that you measure the diseases that you know are rampant in the cult. You acknowledge that every person is predisposed to infect others with their disease. Every disease I have, I'm predisposed to give to you. Well, you can either work to heal the disease and provide some protection in the meantime, or you just become a rampant disease disseminating cult, which we've already got. So, in a somewhat sociopathic cult, someone who cares about this is unusual. How do I know it's unusual? I've contacted 600 people associated with High. Not one of them is committed to making these changes or going on camera we're talking about it. So we've got an absolute certainty that the status quo is in effect, will continue to be in effect, and that high will pump out a certain amount of sexually abused trauma survivors as part of its routine. Is it 10%, 20%? Who knows? Most of us are so trauma illiterate, we don't even realize it's happening and don't have language for it, and we can't connect it, because we're trauma illiterate, to the things that are traumatizing us. Well, I can connect my trauma to more than 100 specific incidents with more than 100 specific people on team, in the facilitators, and in the community. Why? Because I took the time to be trauma literate. Now I know what the symptoms were that I saw in so many of my lovers who were trauma illiterate and also demonstrating traumatic symptoms. So, but they still don't know why they're doing what they're doing. And that's the problem. And that's the cruelty of calling all that love, because it masks the blindness. They're stuck because they believe something that's hurting them is helping them, and they have no map to figure out that that's a false statement. They're stuck round and round and round. That's a terrible situation. So I can make this video. I can make websites, and that can protect people who, for the most part, have been abused. That's usually who finds me. People who have been abused and wonder if other people have been abused, and then they find me in the websites. Most people don't come across this narrative until after they've been abused. That's not good enough for me. So how does high occupy a position that ensures that more and more people win in more and more ways? Well, the easiest thing is for any ethical core in the team and the participants, maybe there's one or two facilitators who've been waiting and not happy with what's going on but haven't broken ranks. Is there any core within the organization that actually is committed to this? Because you can't force sociopaths to be empaths if they're fine being sociopaths, or if they call being sociopaths being loving and have no interest in learning the distinctions because they don't want to know their impact and they don't want to respond to it. That's just, a dead organization. Now, my options in the event of zero participation from within any group in high is to shut it down with legal action. Through civil and or criminal cases, I can sue each of the facilitators individually, practicing therapy without a license, inducing PTSD in their therapeutic client, recommending untrained sexual abusers without a license, you name it. I can also create a national documentary and tell the story. I can also wait, because with every year that high does what it does, there are more victims. And they contact me. And so even if my legal time expires, because there are limits and how long it takes to sue someone and stuff, then they have it took me 6 years to learn all this. It takes a lot to recover from that level of betrayal and ignorance from all of your therapists, basically. But it's not hard to catch up in a year now that I've put all this data and patterns out there and can be an ally. So that's, also an option. I can be an ally And because high is so poorly managed, and that's on everyone, meaning in a chauvinistic cult, relationships are not viewed as essential. I know women who will spend more money on their hair than they will becoming emotionally literate. That's a chauvinist through and through. Materialist, insane chauvinist, who thinks, according to the ads, because our government has sold airtime to the highest bidder, and the highest bidder is always the one who can make the most money for the least amount of effort. And the easiest way to do that is lies. And so advertisement is based primarily on deception. And we pretend that if a woman's hairdo or breast size or something like that is right, that they're going to have a great marriage. What a load of crap. But it's only our citizens that learn this crap over and over and again. Who cares about them? We as a people have to pay the price in time, money, energy, and effort to actually become emotionally and psychologically literate. Now, this cult promotes sex. So high is able to survive when many organizations have gone defunct because it sells sex. That's how, I think it was, Aaron Campbell? Anyway, the therapist that recommended high to me recommended it to me because I said, I'm 28 years old. I know almost nothing about sex. And I think I'm kind of ready to learn about sex. And he said, oh, I know the place for you. Go to the Human Awareness Institute. So a month later, I had taken 3 workshops, and I was learning about sex. I just wasn't learning how to stop being traumatized, how to stop triggering attachment disorder, because I didn't know I needed to know that way more than I needed to know about sex, because I'm, like everyone else in this cult, ignorant of my own ignorance. And my cult wants to keep it that way. So I've tested that out, by the way, by offering to give speeches to any of the kids for free at my school. They want nothing to do with it. They don't want their kids actually learning something. And the teachers told me the parents would have a fit if their kids were learning things without going through the parents' control. And that all kinds of things have to be kept away from these kids because it upsets certain fear-based, shame-based parents that would like to keep their children ignorant of all kinds of things. So we're committed as a cult to willful ignorance. Now, why should that surprise us? Because I'd like to tell the high community all these things, and the facilitator body has gone to extraordinary measures to see that I'm one of the few people ever to be blocked from all direct access to the high community. The facilitators don't want to talk to me, and they don't want me to talk to anyone else. We're committed as a cult to willful ignorance about everything important, with the common denominator that what's important reveals the flaws and inadequacy in the cult and in the power structure. The power structure is perfectly fine with anything being disseminated that strengthens their power base and their control, but not that helps their people at the expense of weakening the power position. Why? Well, just look at our president. Why? Because we respect people in power, and we don't know what a leader is. We don't respect or disrespect leaders because we don't know what it is. We've never met one in most cases. But certainly, being in power, being famous, being a leader, being in a masculine role. That's what a leader is, a masculine role. We just don't ask our leaders to be competent to lead. And most of the people who want to lead because they feel terribly small inside, because their feminine side has been torn to shreds. They're trying to medicate that inadequacy. They look around desperately in their cult and say, how can I feel important? And the cult says, I know, be a leader. Meaning, bribe, hook, break the law, hook a recruit, get to the top, and then everyone will think you're important, not because you're important or know what you're doing, but because you're at the top. And if you don't know what you're doing, hide it for goodness sake. And so you have desperate people trying to, poor Donald Trump. What a shitty father he had. Don't blame Donald. Blame the cult that left Donald in Fred's care. If you have a Fred, you'll get a Donald. And in a cult as psychologically illiterate as our own, they will be rewarded for sociopathic behavior. You get to be the leader, you're the best sociopath we've got. You lie better, you manipulate better, you bribe better, good. Be our president, because that's our archetype. And we're all fine with that as long as we don't have to do the very hard work of becoming psychologically illiterate. So this is not about Peter Sandhill or Ann Watts. This is about our cult. Those of us that stand by and do nothing, and those that take a stand, work their asses off for a little bit of cultural evolution. So the combination of a documentary, legal action, supporting the next round of victims, which is inevitable in this protocol, and a 20-year time frame guarantees that just one person, and I've left my will, because one of the things that power structures do, if you can see it more clearly in the US government level, is assassination, character assassination, bankruptcy. Power structures that are sociopathic and scared attack the healthiest members of their group. Think Edward Snowden, think Julian Assange. They attack the healthiest members in their group. And they try and destroy the whistleblower, the one that's acting in public interest. And in an apathetic, psychologically illiterate public, it often works. So anyway, I have left instructions in my will about what competent people will continue to do with my money to see that the position